During Christmas, I announced I was pregnant. My mother said, "I don't want you or that bastard in this family. You're dead to me and out of the will." So I left my present and walked out. When she opened that box, she screamed nonstop. My name's Harper Dawson. I'm 29 years old and I'm a registered nurse in Portland. Christmas at my parents' house always felt like a performance, and I was the lead actress in a play I never auditioned for. The scent of pine from the towering tree and the cinnamon from Mom's simmering cider was supposed to smell like love, but to me, it always smelled like obligation. It was the fragrance of expectation, of a role I was meant to play without complaint. Every ornament on that tree was perfectly placed, each glittering ball and hand-blown glass angel reflecting a sterile, calculated perfection. Every ribbon on the mountain of gifts was tied into a flawless bow, a mirror of how we were all supposed to present ourselves to the world, neat, tidy, and without a single loose end. My mother, Diana, was the director of this annual production. She floated through the grand living room, her smile as crisp and cold as the December air clinging to the window panes. Her compliments were really critiques, her hugs were just a brief, stiff positioning of bodies. My father, Gregory, was a ghost at his own party, a silent stagehand tasked with refilling drinks and avoiding eye contact. He'd mastered the art of being present but absent, a shadow who offered no support and no conflict. And my younger brother, Tyler, lounged on the velvet sofa, a perpetual fixture of entitlement. He was already 3 glasses of expensive scotch in, his eyes glazed over, simply waiting for the next handout that would inevitably come his way. This year was different, though. This year, I was holding a secret, a tiny, fluttering hope tucked away inside me like the last unopened present under the tree. It was a secret I thought might finally make this house feel like a home. Rule number 1 in the Dawson household was to uphold the family image at all costs. We were an old timber family, a name that meant something in certain Portland circles, and that image was our currency. Rule number 2. Your choices are not your own, they are reflections, for better or worse, on the family name. A good choice brought a nod of approval, a bad one brought a winter of silent disapproval. And rule number 3, the most important one. Money solves problems and affection is transactional. Mom never said, "I love you," she said, "Don't embarrass me." Her love was conditional, a reward for compliance. Dad never said, "I'm proud of you." He would say, "Your mother is pleased," as if her satisfaction was the ultimate measure of my worth. Tyler never had to follow the rules, not really. He was her project, the prodigal son who was always in need of a little help. His failed business ventures, his unpaid bills, his general inability to launch himself into adulthood, these were not seen as failures, but as opportunities for Mom to manage, to control, to keep him tethered to her. My job in this dysfunctional ecosystem was to be the polished daughter, the success story. My nursing career, my sensible car, my tidy savings account, they were all meant to balance out his perpetual state of disarray. I was the proof that she had done something right, but the unspoken rule I was about to break was the most important one of all, the one that underpinned everything else: never, ever choose love over legacy. My husband, Marco Reyes, was everything my family wasn't: warm, genuine, and unapologetically himself. He was a gifted tattoo artist, a true craftsman whose hands told stories on skin. To my mother, his profession was a novelty at best and a disgrace at worst. He was, in her words, whispered to a family friend over the phone when she thought I couldn't hear, a stain on the Dawson name. I'll never forget the first time I brought him home for dinner. The air in the foyer was thick with judgment. Mom looked at his arms, covered in intricate, beautiful artwork, and asked with a saccharine smile, "Oh dear, were you in a gang?" Dad just gave a limp handshake and retreated to his study with the newspaper, his standard disappearing act. Marco never flinched. He met their polished coldness with a quiet strength that I'd fallen in love with. He answered her question calmly, explaining the history of Japanese tattooing with an artist's passion, turning her insult into a teachable moment she hadn't asked for and didn't want. He saw me, Harper, not the role I was supposed to play. He saw my fatigue after a 12-hour shift, my frustration with my family, my deep desire for a life that felt real. His family, in stark contrast, had welcomed me with booming laughter and bone-crushing hugs. Their small, cluttered home in a different part of the city was filled with more genuine love and warmth than my parents' sprawling, silent mansion. Sitting at their table, passing plates of food that steamed up the windows, I felt a sense of belonging I had never known. Now, at my parents' Christmas gathering, holding Marco's hand under the dining table was my small act of rebellion, my silent promise that I was with him, no matter what. After the strained gift-giving was over and the floor was littered with expensive, impersonal wrapping paper, I stood up. Marco's hand found the small of my back, a warm, steadying pressure. The room quieted, all eyes turning to me. My heart was pounding against my ribs, a frantic bird beating its wings. "We have one more gift," I said, my voice clearer than I expected. "It's for everyone." I took a deep breath, looked from my mother's expectant face to my father's carefully neutral one. "Marco and I are pregnant." For a single, beautiful second, the facade cracked. A look of genuine shock, then a flicker of something like hope crossed my father's face. Tyler snorted into his scotch, a sound of dismissive amusement. But it was my mother's reaction that sucked all the air from the room. Her polite smile didn't just vanish, it was erased, leaving behind a mask of cold fury. The festive atmosphere evaporated, replaced by a silence so profound I could hear the hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen. "No," she said, her voice like ice splintering, "you will not bring that child into this family." She stood, her posture ramrod straight, the queen pronouncing a sentence. "As of this moment, you are no longer my daughter, you are disowned. You are out of the will, to me, you are dead." The jolt wasn't from the words themselves. I'd been hearing variations of her disapproval for years. It was the finality. The performance was over. My goal was simple, to have a family of my own. The obstacle was the woman who gave birth to me. I didn't cry. I didn't scream or argue. The shock was so cold and sharp that it bypassed emotion and went straight to clarity. All the years of trying, of contorting myself into the shape she wanted, they all fell away. There was nothing left to fight for. I just nodded once, a small, final acknowledgement of the truth that had always been there. Marco started to speak, his voice low and angry, ready to leap to my defense, but I put a hand on his arm, stopping him. "It's okay," I said, my voice unnervingly steady. "I understand." My understanding was complete. I walked over to my purse, which I'd left on a chair by the door, my movements deliberate and unhurried. I reached inside and took out a small, beautifully wrapped gift box. It was covered in elegant silver paper tied with a perfect white ribbon. I had chosen it carefully. I walked back to the center of the room and placed it on the polished mahogany coffee table right in front of where my mother stood. "I thought this might happen," I said, my voice even. "This is for you." Her eyes, narrowed and suspicious, flickered down to the box. She thought it was a pathetic plea, a last-ditch sentimental trinket meant to guilt her into changing her mind. It wasn't. It was an arsenal. It was the end of her reign. I turned without another word and walked out the front door, Marco right behind me, his hand protectively on my back. I didn't look back at the wreckage of my old life. The winter air was so cold it felt clean, scrubbing the scent of pine and false cheer from my lungs. It was a stark, welcome contrast to the suffocating atmosphere of that house. Marco drove, one hand gripping the steering wheel, the other holding mine so tightly I could feel the pulse in his thumb. He was radiating a silent, protective anger on my behalf. The streetlights of the wealthy neighborhood slid past, each one illuminating a perfect, quiet home that probably held its own secrets. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice low and careful as if I might shatter. A strange, surprising feeling washed over me, a lightness I hadn't felt in years. "I'm free," I said, and the profound truth of that statement settled deep in my bones. I wasn't an orphan, I was an escapee. The small gift box I'd left behind was my first real tactic in a war I hadn't wanted but had prepared for nonetheless. It wasn't a plea for reconciliation, it was a declaration of independence. Inside that box, I knew my mother would eventually find a single, innocuous-looking USB drive. A small, cold piece of plastic that held years of her own cruelty, meticulously documented. There were screenshots of her demeaning text messages, her polite but cutting emails. There were notes from my physician, tying the spikes in my blood pressure during the first trimester to specific, stressful confrontations with her. And there were bank statements, the real bomb, revealing the quiet siphoning of thousands of dollars to fund Tyler's life. She thought she held all the power, all the cards. She was about to find out how wrong she was. For the first time, looking out at the city lights as we drove toward our small, warm apartment, I felt a future that was entirely mine and my baby's. 3 days passed, 3 days of absolute, unnerving silence. I half expected a furious phone call, a barrage of abusive text messages, something, but there was nothing. The quiet was more unsettling than an attack. I started to wonder if she'd thrown the box away unopened. Then, on the third day, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. I hesitated, then answered. The man on the line introduced himself as James Porter, an attorney. He said he was the person in charge of a special trust set up years ago by my late grandfather, Walter Dawson. My grandfather had been the patriarch of the Timber family, a man who saw things clearly, including, it turned out, his own daughter. James spoke in calm, measured tones that were a balm to my frayed nerves. "Miss Dawson," he said, "I'm calling to inform you that the primary condition of the Walter Dawson Trust has been met." He explained that my grandfather, in his wisdom, had anticipated that my mother might one day try to control my life choices by threatening my inheritance. He had seen her manipulative nature long before I had been willing to name it. The condition for the trust's release was simple and specific: any formal attempt by Diana Dawson to financially punish me for my choice of partner or for any life decision she deemed inappropriate. Her Christmas morning declaration, made loudly and clearly in front of witnesses, was exactly that. She had opened the gift. She had plugged in the drive. She had triggered the trap herself. James Porter laid out the details in simple terms. My grandfather Walter, a man I remembered for his warm, rumbling laugh and the scent of sawdust on his clothes, had seen my mother for who she was. He'd seen her obsession with appearances, her need for control, her belief that money was a tool to bend people to her will. So, 6 months before he passed away, he had quietly moved a significant portion of his personal assets, $4.8 million, into a protected trust with my name on it. It was his final act of love for me, a way of giving me the freedom he knew my mother never would. He had created an escape hatch for me, and my mother had just unknowingly pushed the button to open it. The money was now legally, irrevocably mine, already in the process of being transferred into an account under my sole control. It was completely untouchable by Diana or anyone else. The letter I'd included in the box with the USB drive had made my intentions clear. It wasn't a negotiation. It outlined my terms: no contact, no more access to my life, and absolutely no access to my child. My mother's grand, dramatic gesture to leave me with nothing had, in fact, left me with everything. The irony was so sharp, so perfect, it almost made me laugh out loud. She had tried to slam a door in my face, and in doing so had unlocked a vault. The first counterattack wasn't a direct confrontation. It was quieter, more insidious. It was a whisper campaign. Old family friends, people who had known me since I was a child, started looking at me with a mixture of pity and disdain when I saw them at the grocery store. Their smiles became tight, their greetings clipped. Then came the text from my cousin, someone I'd once been close to. "I can't believe you'd manipulate your mother like that for money," it read. "She's heartbroken." The narrative was already being written and disseminated through her powerful social network. I was the greedy, ungrateful daughter who had callously tricked her poor, ailing mother. Mom was painting herself as the victim, a heartbroken matriarch betrayed by her own conniving child. It was a role she played with devastating skill. She was using her years of curated relationships, her social influence, as a weapon to isolate me. She couldn't control my finances anymore, so she was trying to destroy my reputation. It was a new kind of warfare, fought not with angry words but with polite, concerned phone calls and carefully worded emails expressing worry over my mental state. This sudden loss of my social standing was a small but visible cost, a constant, painful reminder of the world I had been forced to leave behind. My simple tactic of walking away wasn't going to be enough. She was following me with her lies. The campaign then escalated from our shared social circles to my professional life, a move that was far more dangerous. I was at work, charting on a patient, when I was paged to my supervisor's office. Laura Bennett, my nursing supervisor, was a fair, no-nonsense woman I deeply respected. She looked uncomfortable as I sat down, holding a printed-out letter in her hand. "Harper, we received an anonymous complaint," she said, her eyes full of professional regret. She slid the letter across the desk. The words swam before my eyes. It claimed I was emotionally unstable due to postpartum issues and a contentious family dispute. The letter was a masterpiece of venom disguised as concern. It suggested I was unfit to care for patients, that my personal turmoil meant my judgment was compromised. It was filled with intimate-sounding details about my life, all of them twisted to look like professional liabilities. There was no name signed at the bottom, but I knew who sent it. The language, the veiled cruelty, the strategic use of medical-sounding terms, it was pure Diana. She was trying to take away the one thing I had built entirely on my own, the career that gave me purpose and independence. My stomach turned to ice. This wasn't just about family drama anymore. This was a direct attack on my livelihood and on the security of my new family. Laura Bennett watched my face as I read the letter, her expression unreadable. When I finished, I folded it carefully and placed it back on her desk. She looked me straight in the eye. "This is garbage," she said, her voice firm. "Do you have any idea who might have sent this?" I decided in that moment that the only way forward was the truth. I explained the situation with my mother, keeping my voice steady and professional. I didn't embellish or get emotional. I simply stated the facts of the disinheritance on Christmas, my grandfather's trust, and my mother's subsequent reaction. Laura listened without a single flicker of judgment, her gaze never leaving mine. She had seen my work day in and day out. She'd seen my dedication, my compassion, and my composure under the most intense pressure imaginable. "Harper, you are one of my best nurses," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. "I've seen you handle life-and-death situations without breaking a sweat. This is nothing." She told me that hospital policy required her to document the complaint and place it in my file, but she was also filing it with her own official endorsement of my complete fitness to work, calling the complaint baseless and likely malicious. The complaint failed. My mother's attempt to use a bureaucratic system against me had backfired because my own merit, my own reputation that I had earned, spoke for itself. It was a small victory, but a crucial one. It proved that her influence had limits. In that sterile office, I had an ally, someone who saw my character, not my last name. A few days later, my dad called me for the first time since that horrible Christmas morning. He sounded exhausted, as if he'd aged a decade in a few short weeks. "Your mother, she's not handling this well," he said, the understatement of the century. I didn't offer sympathy or platitudes. I just listened, holding the phone tightly. He confessed that he couldn't defend what she did. He was horrified by her cruelty, and even more so by the anonymous complaint sent to my hospital. "This isn't about family anymore, Harper," he whispered, his voice cracking. "This is unhinged." The foundation of their long marriage, a silent, decades-long agreement to maintain the pristine facade at all costs, was finally crumbling under the strain. Dad had spent a lifetime avoiding conflict, burying his head in his work and his study, but he couldn't avoid this. Mom's obsession had become a liability he could no longer ignore or enable. He then admitted something that stunned me. He knew about my grandfather's trust all along. He had been a witness when it was signed. He just hoped I'd never have a reason to need it. The problem was wider and deeper than I'd ever assumed. It wasn't just my mother's active cruelty, it was my father's lifelong, passive complicity. The stakes sharpened in that moment. This wasn't just about my freedom anymore. It was about the complete and total implosion of the family I grew up in. It started subtly. A dark sedan I didn't recognize parked across the street from our little bungalow. At first, I dismissed it. Portland is a busy city. People park in strange places all the time, but the car was there again the next day and the day after that. It was always in a slightly different spot, sometimes a few houses down, sometimes closer, but it was always there, a silent, dark shape in my peripheral vision. Marco noticed it too. "Who's that?" he asked one evening, looking out the living room window as he gently rocked our newborn daughter, Grace, in his arms. A cold knot of dread formed in my stomach. This felt like her. It was exactly her style, intimidation without direct confrontation, a way to make her presence felt without ever showing her face. I started trying to vary my routine, leaving for work at different times, taking different routes to the grocery store. The car's presence was inconsistent, which was almost more unsettling than if it had been there constantly. Was I just being paranoid? Was the stress of everything, a new baby, a family at war, finally getting to me? I didn't think so. I started taking pictures of the car on my phone whenever I saw it, discreetly documenting the license plate, the dates, and the times. Just in case. It felt like a profound violation, an unseen enemy camped just outside the sanctuary of my home, a home that was supposed to be my safe harbor from the storm. My options were narrowing. I couldn't just ignore this. The feeling of being watched intensified until it was a constant, prickling sensation on the back of my neck. I'd be in the produce section at the grocery store and notice a man in the same aisle, not buying anything, just lingering by the avocados. I'd be at the park pushing Grace in the baby swing, and I'd see a person sitting on a bench pretending to look at their phone, but the screen would be dark and the device would be angled just so, pointing toward me. These were all small things, individually easy to dismiss as coincidence or paranoia, but they started adding up, forming a disturbing pattern. The world outside my home no longer felt safe. It felt like an extension of my mother's surveillance, a panopticon of her own making. I started keeping the blinds drawn during the day. I found myself double-checking the locks on the doors and windows before going to bed. Marco, seeing the toll it was taking on me, went out and bought a security camera for our front porch. We weren't taking any chances. The psychological pressure was immense. It was a constant, low-grade hum of anxiety that never quite went away. She was trying to make me feel small, scared, and isolated, to shrink my world until all I had was the four walls of my house. And it was working. The vulnerability I already felt as a new mother was magnified 100 times over. I felt like a target. The proof that I wasn't losing my mind came from an unexpected source. Marco's friend, a mechanic named Ben who owned a shop downtown, owed him a favor. I had sent Ben the license plate number from the sedan that was always parked on our street, along with the photos I'd taken. I asked him if he could run it just to see who it was registered to. I was half expecting it to come back to some random person confirming I was just being paranoid. But a few hours later, Ben called back. The car wasn't registered to an individual. It was registered to a company, Brooks Investigations. A private investigator. My blood ran cold. My fear wasn't paranoia at all. It was an accurate assessment of a threat. My own mother had hired someone to follow me, to track my movements, to watch my home, to document my life as a new mother. For what purpose? To find some flaw, some mistake she could use against me. The thought was sickening. This was a bridge burned to ashes. This was a line crossed from which there could be no return. A surge of cold, hard anger replaced the fear that had been gnawing at me for weeks. She wasn't just trying to hurt my feelings anymore. She was actively stalking me and my child. This was the first piece of hard, tangible proof I had of her harassment, something undeniable and, more importantly, legally actionable. The ticking clock was my family's sense of safety, and my mother had just set it to 0. Ben did some more digging for me. The owner of Brooks Investigations was a man named Calvin Brooks, a former police officer with a quiet reputation for being discreet but tenacious. A quick online search confirmed it. The firm's website was sterile and professional, listing family law support and discreet surveillance as specialties. It made my skin crawl. But the most damning piece of information, the final nail in the coffin of my doubt, came from a friend of a friend who worked in the billing department of a local credit union. It was a long shot, but I asked if she could check for any recent large payments to that company. An hour later, she sent me a screenshot. It was an invoice. A payment of $3,600 had been made to Brooks Investigations just a few weeks prior. The name in the paid by field was Diana Dawson. It was all there in black and white, the investigator's name, his company, and the payment from my mother's personal account. The proof was irrefutable. I now had a target. It wasn't just my mother's amorphous campaign of cruelty and rumors, it was a specific person, a specific action, a specific crime. I called my lawyer, James Porter, immediately. I laid it all out for him on the phone, my voice perfectly calm, betraying none of the rage and violation I felt inside. I told him about the car, the constant feeling of being watched, the investigator's name, and the invoice. My voice didn't shake. I was done being scared. I was ready to fight back. Looking at the digital copy of that invoice, seeing my mother's name so clearly linked to the act of hiring a man to stalk me was the moment everything flipped. The major, undeniable truth was this: my mother would never stop. There was no line she wouldn't cross to get what she wanted, which was control over me. She would not get tired. She would not feel remorse. She would only escalate her tactics, finding new and more invasive ways to impose her will. Waiting for her to change or simply give up was not a strategy, it was a childish fantasy. I looked over at the bassinet where Grace was sleeping, her tiny chest rising and falling in a rhythm of perfect innocence. That sight, that feeling of overwhelming love, clarified everything. The primal, ferocious instinct to protect my child overrode every last ounce of lingering guilt or misplaced family obligation. My mother wasn't a difficult parent anymore. She was a threat. A clear and present danger to my daughter's safety and to my own sanity. The choice became brutally simple. It was my mother's obsession or my daughter's peace. There was no middle ground. There was no negotiating. I chose my daughter. It was an irreversible choice, a silent vow I made over her crib in the quiet of the afternoon. In that moment, I fully accepted the cost. Any lingering, microscopic chance of a future relationship with my mother, however toxic and conditional, was gone forever. I was choosing to amputate a part of my life in order to save the rest. When I spoke to James Porter again, my voice was different. The fear and uncertainty were gone, replaced by a steely resolve that surprised even me. I didn't ask him, "What can we do?" I told him, "This is what we are going to do." I laid out the evidence methodically, like I was presenting a patient case at the hospital. My time-stamped photos of the car, the license plate number, the name of Calvin Brooks's investigation company, and the confirmed invoice from my mother. "She hired a private investigator to stalk me and my infant daughter," I said, the words cold and hard. "This is harassment and I want it to stop now." James agreed immediately. He said we had more than enough to file for a restraining order against her. He warned me it would be ugly. He said my mother would fight back with everything she had, that this would drag the Dawson family name through the mud, that it would all become very public. "I know," I said, my gaze fixed on the rain starting to streak down my window. "I'm not trying to win a popularity contest, I'm trying to protect my child." There was a pause on his end of the line, and then he said with a new respect in his voice, "Okay, Harper. Let's get to work." Hiring a lawyer to take legal action against my own mother felt like a monumental betrayal of everything I was raised to believe about family loyalty. But it was also the first time I felt truly, powerfully in control of my own life. The legal process, it turned out, was cold and impersonal, which was a profound relief. There was no room for emotion in the paperwork, only facts. James drew up the documents for a temporary restraining order. It detailed the incident on Christmas morning, the anonymous, malicious complaint to my workplace, and the hiring of Calvin Brooks to conduct surveillance on me. It laid out a clear, undeniable pattern of escalating harassment. We included copies of my photographs and the invoice as exhibits, physical proof of her campaign against me. The order, if granted, would legally forbid Diana from contacting me in any way, from coming within 500 feet of my home or workplace, and from hiring any third parties to watch or contact me on her behalf. Signing my name on that sworn affidavit was one of the most significant moments of my life. It was my testimony, my truth, finally codified into a legal document that had real power. This wasn't an emotional outburst or a family squabble anymore. It was a calculated, necessary move to build a legal fortress around my new family. The personal cost was crystal clear. The public battle would be humiliating for the Dawson name, the very thing my mother worshipped above all else. I was using her own tactics of scorched earth warfare to destroy the image she had spent a lifetime curating. My goal was no longer simply to escape and be left alone. My goal was to enforce my boundaries with the full and formidable power of the law. It wasn't enough to hope she would leave me alone. I needed a guarantee, a legal document that ensured she could not reach me. The inheritance from my grandfather wasn't just a safety net anymore, it was a war chest, and I would use it to fund this fight for as long as it took. I told Marco the entire plan that night. He looked at me with a mixture of pride and deep concern in his eyes. "Whatever you need, I'm with you," he said, pulling me into a hug. "We're with you." Later that night, my dad called again. His voice was heavy. "I'm filing for divorce from your mother," he said without any preamble. Her actions, her hiring of a private investigator, had finally shattered his decades of denial. He couldn't live with the woman she had revealed herself to be. The family unit I had grown up in was officially collapsing, and I was the one who had pulled the final, load-bearing thread. And yet, I felt a strange, profound sense of calm settle over me. The chaos was external now. Internally, I knew exactly what I was fighting for, a future where love, not control, was the foundation of my home. A process server delivered the temporary restraining order to my mother at her country club during her weekly brunch with her closest friends. James had advised this tactical move. It created multiple, unimpeachable witnesses and prevented her from claiming she was never served. According to my cousin, who called me later in a hushed, horrified whisper, Mom didn't scream or make a scene. She simply accepted the papers from the server, read them through with an unreadable expression, folded them neatly, placed them in her expensive purse, and excused herself from the table with quiet dignity. Her composure was more terrifying than any outburst would have been. It was the icy calm of a general planning her counteroffensive. The news spread through the family and their elite social circle like wildfire. The narrative was immediately and expertly twisted. I wasn't just greedy anymore, now I was cruel and vindictive. I had served my own mother with a restraining order while she was surrounded by her friends. In her world, that was an unforgivable sin, a public humiliation of the highest order. The antagonist was retaliating decisively, using the weapon she knew best, social shame. The first consequence was the sudden, deafening silence from aunts, uncles, and cousins who had known me my whole life. My phone, which had been buzzing with their concern-trolling texts, went completely quiet. I had been officially excommunicated. They didn't have to name me to make it about me. Within hours, concerned friends started posting on Facebook and other sites I didn't even recognize at first. Vague, heartstring-tugging statuses about children who punish their parents and how money can change people. Photos of Mom looking frail and sorrowful, captions about elder abuse and betrayal that invited exactly the kind of polite outrage she wanted. Comments piled up, people I went to kindergarten with offering condolences, strangers lecturing on filial duty. A few of her closer friends left long, measured essays about family values, written to sound gentle but heavy with accusation. It was a masterful campaign. No single post called me out by name, but everyone in our circle knew the story: the daughter who took advantage of an elderly mother, the greedy child who weaponized a will. The posts were written in that syrupy, performative language Mom used when she wanted to look compassionate while she stabbed. Marco wanted to answer. He fumed at the possibility of letting lies stand unchallenged. He paced the living room one night, hands balled at his sides, insisting we should post our side, explain the truth. I sat on the couch and thought about saying something, anything, but every response felt like throwing gasoline on a fire. The restraining order meant we couldn't engage directly without risking more trouble. Silence became a line I had to hold. People read my silence however they wanted, as guilt, as weakness, as arrogance. I watched as my phone filled with strangers' opinions and old friends' cold judgments. The humiliation stung in a way the legal documents never could. It wasn't just that they believed her, it was that they wanted to. They preferred the neat, sympathetic narrative to the messier truth. I let the posts exist out there in the noise while I held my warm, sleeping child and kept my mouth shut. Sometimes the only kind of victory you get is the one you survive. The social fallout turned people I thought would be constants into ghosts. There were faces I hadn't expected to lose: women who'd brought casseroles to my boyfriend's tattoo shop when Marco first opened, old neighbors who'd watched me learn to ride a bike. One afternoon, I ran into Aunt Carol at the pharmacy, a woman who'd pressed out 100 tiny cupcakes in my childhood. She looked at me, then at the floor, then turned and walked away as if she'd mistaken me for someone rude. I stood frozen in the toothpaste aisle, the bright fluorescent lights buzzing above, and felt the hollow where my past used to be. Other friends stopped returning calls. Invitations to small gatherings that once included me arrived with no explanation of why they were local only. I knew the answers before the third meeting of concerned friends had been posted. A neighbor who used to borrow sugar from my mom now waved curtly and closed the front door. The people who'd shown up at recitals and graduations became careful about making eye contact. Photos from family weddings that used to be passed around now sat in albums that weren't opened when I was around. The loss was like winter settling over a garden. Everything worth tending was wilting, not because I'd been cruel, but because it was easier for them to side with the more powerful story. It hurt more than I expected. There's a particular loneliness when the people who made your childhood feel solid decide you'd broken something that couldn't be fixed. I caught myself drinking coffee on the porch early some mornings, looking at old, discarded ornaments in the attic when I helped Marco clean, and feeling like the world that celebrated my small triumphs had quietly turned its back. The betrayal pricked and prickled, but it also clarified something primal. Those were not losses I could mourn into a better life. They were severed cords, and the work now was to sew new ones with people who loved without conditions. Dad called the day after the restraining order was served, his voice thin and as if he'd been underwater. "I'm done, Harper," he said simply, and I heard a kind of release in that small sentence. He told me he'd started the paperwork to sell his shares in the timber company and to file for divorce. Hearing it out loud felt heavy and also, strangely, right. It was the final stand of a man who'd been complicit for decades but who finally couldn't stomach the cruelty any longer. He didn't make excuses for the past, and he didn't ask me to forgive him for everything he'd allowed. He said, in the tired way of someone who'd been small his whole life and was choosing to be full-sized for the first time, that he wanted peace. He admitted he'd been afraid for years, afraid of Mom's moods, afraid of the social consequences of disagreeing with her. He told me about nights in his study when he had wanted to speak up but had shut his mouth because it was easier, because the cost of rocking the boat seemed too high. That admission didn't undo the past, but it did remove some of the fog. It explained how our house had become a stage and how everyone learned to play a part. Selling his shares, walking away from the club memberships and the dinners that had defined him was his own quiet rebellion. When he came over for dinner that Sunday after he'd moved into a small condo downtown, he looked smaller but steadier. He laughed at something Marco said about a ridiculous tattoo commission, and it sounded like the dad I'd wanted. He reached out to hold Grace during dessert, and I watched him learn to be a grandfather in real time. Awkward fingers, a soft voice, a face softening in the light of a child's trust. He told me he'd given his lawyer instructions to avoid any nasty legal fights over the house. He didn't care for revenge. He wanted the weight lifted. In that moment, he became an ally in a way he hadn't been for much of my life. But his decision to step away from Mom's world made her furious in ways that were uneven and loud. He was branded a traitor by people who had once called him neighbor and friend. Invitations stopped coming for him too. The cost of choosing who he wanted to be was immediate and public. Still, seeing him choose authenticity over performance made the whole endeavor, my fight, his divorce, feel less absurd. It proved that people can change, that the patterns woven into families can be cut. Dad's final stand wasn't dramatic. It was a steady, necessary act of survival. Watching him leave a life built on pretense gave me permission to fully embrace the life I was building instead. The knock came late, after I'd finally managed to get Grace to sleep and after Marco had collapsed on the couch, exhausted. It was hesitant, the kind of knock that sounded like someone practicing how to ask for forgiveness. I wasn't expecting anyone. Tyler hadn't called since the scene at Christmas, so when Marco peeked through the peephole and muttered, "It's your brother," my chest tightened the way an old wound breaks at cold weather. I opened the door with a small flare of irritation. I wasn't in the mood for more drama. Tyler stood there under the porch light looking like something had taken color out of him. His jacket hung loose, the collar turned up, and he had the kind of 5 o'clock shadow that said he'd been awake too long. He didn't reek of booze, which would have made this easier to dismiss. He smelled faintly of motor oil and cheap cologne. His eyes were bloodshot and haunted. "Can I come in?" he asked, voice rough, words tripping over each other. He looked smaller than I remembered, which was either time or consequence. I almost